And joining us for more on this is Dr. Chuck Freilich, former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor and a professor of political science at Tel Aviv University, joining us from the town of Hoda Sharon. Chuck, thanks for joining us. I don't know if that the substance of Prime Minister Netanyahu's comments are surprising, but just the fact, since we know that Israel has been or is reported to be acting against Iran even while these talks are going on to revive the nuclear deal, but the fact that he would so explicitly say and almost perhaps warn or what could say threaten the U.S. That Israel will continue to act definitely does seem a sort of an unusual statement to make.
Well, I think, and I say this with great regret and some fear, that we have a prime minister who is simply out of control, a man who sees his political career crumbling, his potential risk of going to jail increasing by the hour, and he will say almost anything at this point. I think on the very day that it was announced that Israel will be asking for another $1 billion in American aid to buy more Iron Domes and to replenish stocks used up in the recent fighting, to come out against the United States is irresponsible to the extreme. Even if you believe that the nuclear deal is misguided, and many of us and current and former officials in the defense establishment believe that it was the best and remains the best of the bad alternatives that Israel faces, even if you think that's the case, to come out and say it in the way that the prime minister did is, again, simply irresponsible. Everybody knows that if push comes to shove, if all other alternatives have been exhausted, Israel may have to act, whether the U.S., whether other countries approve or not. When it comes to the final crunch, we will defend ourselves no matter what we have to do. But to come out and say what he said about the United States, our number one ally, this is insanity.
Well, Defense Minister Benny Gantz announcing after that a lightning trip to the United States. Reports are in part, that's also, you mentioned the replenishing, to a lobby for the replenishing of the Iron Dome arsenal, but perhaps some damage control and maybe also to speak a little or reassure the U.S. on some kind of continuity if this new government comes into being next week?
Well, I think on the continuity issue that he can reassure the U.S. administration. I would imagine that he doesn't need this, as you called it, a lightning trip for damage control. That will take time. We have still not gotten over the damage that Mr. Netanyahu caused when he appeared in Congress and took on President Obama in 2015. That was a strategic error, which is one of the primary, not the only, but one of the primary reasons for the collapse in support for Israel on the Democratic side. And if Mr. Netanyahu continues with this now, if he's out of office next week, then it'll be a bygone. It won't be totally forgotten, but it'll be a bygone. But if he remains in office and he continues this track, the impact on the relationship will be really severe. We saw unprecedented events in recent weeks where leading senators, congressmen came out in the midst of fighting when Israel was subjected to rocket attacks, calling to make American military aid to Israel contingent on a change in its Palestinian policy. Now we can add to that its Iran policy. We need the United States very, very, very much. Imagine what would happen if we didn't have American weapons? The IDF would be an empty instrument. Who would prevent repeated sanctions resolutions against Israel in the Security Council, including last week during the fighting?
Right. Well, since we're talking about the new government, we heard Prime Minister Netanyahu just the other day speak about the fact that the presence of such left-wing politicians of Merav Michaeli, of the Labour Party, and Nitzan Horowitz of the Meretz Party in the so-called security cabinet could pose a threat to the future security of the state of Israel. I mean, your response to that as you're a former member of the National Security Council.
I think the primary threat to the state of Israel today comes from threats to our democracy. threats to democracy and to our legal system that are the result of the kind of statements that the Prime Minister has been saying. It is entirely legitimate for him to disagree with Merav Michaeli's positions or Nitzan Horowitz's. They are Israeli patriots. They have a different approach. The kinds of people that the Prime Minister has surrounded himself with, and I would say by his own behavior in recent times, the kind of people who he was trying to bring into a government of his own. When you live in an extraordinarily fragile glass house, you probably shouldn't be throwing stones.
All right, stay with us, Chuck, because there was some other significant related news today. David Barnea stepped into the role as the new chief of Israel's espionage agency known as the Mossad. Now, Barnea is 56 years of age and has been in the Mossad for the past 25 years, serving in various prominent positions, including as its deputy head for the past 2 years under the leadership of Yossi Cohen. He's one of 4 Israel Defense Israel Defense Prizes winners and served in the elite IDF Special Forces unit known as Sayeret Matkal. Now, at a ceremony today, Barnea warned that Iran is working towards a bomb, even as it holds talks with world powers, and expressed the thought that countering Iran is his #1 priority.
As the Prime Minister mentioned, our security challenges are great. At the top of the list is Iran. We need to say loud and clear. Iran is working as we speak to implement its nuclear vision under international protection. With a nuclear deal or without it, with lies and deception, Iran is making progress towards a nuclear weapon.
Now, of course, Chuck, the Mossad is reportedly really been at the forefront of Israel's efforts to counter the Iranian nuclear program through covert operations. Talk to us about going forward, about how you see if the Mossad's role that maybe would be more increased if indeed we see a situation where Iran's nuclear program either advances or this agreement comes in, whether that may counter the need to use the Mossad.
Well, I'm not going to speculate on the Mossad's role. The head of the Mossad today also said that they will continue and even increase their efforts, and I rely on what he said as far as that goes. One can agree or disagree with his position regarding it. He was being critical of the deal, and you can agree with that or disagree with that. I would say, and many other former and current defense officials believe, that the deal was the best of the bad options. The fact is, when the deal was still in effect in early 2018, Iran was at least a year away from having the fissile material for a bomb. Today, there may be 3 months away from having that. As a matter of fact, maybe for 3 bombs. Now, imagine if we were where we are today, where Hezbollah is continuing to grow in strength, where Iran is setting up its military presence, the so-called entrenchment effort in Syria, air, ground, and naval bases and Shiite militias, and we didn't have the nuclear agreement. In the meantime, Iran might have gone nuclear. If that had been the case, we wouldn't be attacking the Iranians in Syria. When countries go nuclear, when your opponents go nuclear, countries behave very, very differently. We would have been greatly constrained in how we were dealing with this. As a matter of fact, we wouldn't have been able to do very much, certainly on the military level. Well, this deal gave us 10 to 15 years through diplomacy. I don't know of any other threat that Israel's ever faced in the history of the country in which we got 10 to 15 years in any way, diplomatically or otherwise. Well, here we got it diplomatically, which is, of course, preferable. And we always reserve the right to launch military action if and when necessary.
Let me ask you, Chuck, under Yossi Cohen served as the head of the Mossad, he also took on many other, it seemed, functions that in previous governments were done by other officials, including the foreign minister, forging relations with, for example, other Arab states. In some ways, he was seen as the closest sort of advisor or official towards Prime Minister Netanyahu. Do you think that is the proper role for a Mossad head to play? You think David Barnea will continue to play such a role in this, or if a new government should arise?
Well, it's no secret that the Mossad engages in secret diplomacy, covert diplomacy, to complement the overt diplomacy conducted by the foreign ministry. And in their case, it's mostly with states that Israel does not or did not have diplomatic relations with in the past. I believe, based on the press reports, that Mr. Cohen played an important role in the breakthroughs in relations with the UAE and Bahrain and maybe some of the others. He is certainly to be commended for that, and I have no doubt that his successor will continue doing that type of thing. That is an appropriate role for the head of the Mossad. What isn't an appropriate role is various other things that Mr. Cohen is thought to have engaged in, or there's some evidence that he engaged in. In some areas, he went beyond the purely intelligence role of the head of Mossad and seemed to be serving as a personal emissary for the prime minister in areas that had a political tint to them. He seems to have also made some moves that had to do with his own future while he was still serving as head of the Mossad. That is a violation of accepted practice and probably even civil service regulations. He will be remembered for being an effective head of Mossad, certainly a good leader, but somebody who introduced an unprecedented level of politicization in the life of the Mossad, and that isn't a good thing.
All right. Some speculation he himself may enter politics in the coming years. It'll be interesting to see if that develops. Dr. Chuck Freilich, thank you for joining us on the rundown.